Namaskar. In my first talk on Srimad Bhagavad Gita in modern world, I have discussed the first translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gita directly created from the original Sanskrit by Charles Wilkins, and the role of Warren Hastings and Charles Wilkins both in the propagation of the message of Gita or in the dissemination of the philosophy of Srimad Bhagavad Gita at global level. Even though Warren Hastings' approach to Srimad Bhagavad Gita was limited by his colonial state of mind, but he could understand that Srimad Bhagavad Gita was a work of immense philosophical and religious value. This was the judgment he expressed unequivocally in his preface. And then the preface of Warren Hastings and the introduction of Charles Wilkins and his translation, when they reached Europe in the form of a published volume, the volume began to attract the attention of some of the foremost intellectuals from Europe, especially France and Germany. And amongst the earliest figures to engage seriously with Gita, with Srimad Bhagavad Gita, were two German scholars, August Wilhelm Schlegel and Wilhelm von Humboldt. August Wilhelm Schlegel and his younger brother both, and then Wilhelm von Humboldt. About Humboldt I will talk in my next discourse or talk. But Friedrich Schlegel and his younger brother Wilhelm Schlegel, these two were amongst the earliest European intellectuals or philosophers to recognize the philosophical importance of Sanskrit literature and especially the philosophical literature of Sanskrit, and they studied Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Friedrich Schlegel did not translate Bhagavad Gita himself, but he played a decisive role in introducing Indian philosophy to German intellectual circles and inspired the scholarly study of Sanskrit in Europe. He was a Sanskrit scholar. He studied Sanskrit from Hamilton. Schlegel and his translation of Gita. The translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gita by his younger brother played an important role in the propagation of the message of Gita and the philosophy of Gita throughout the continent of Europe. And Friedrich Schlegel began studying Sanskrit in Paris around 1802 under the guidance of British Orientalist Alexander Hamilton. His enthusiasm for Indian literature strongly influenced his younger brother, August Wilhelm Schlegel, who became one of the Europe's foremost Sanskrit scholars also. And this was August Wilhelm Schlegel who translated Srimad Bhagavad Gita directly from the original Sanskrit into German. And this translation was with critical notes and annotations and prepared by a scholar who was trained in the textual criticism as well. This was a standard edition of Srimad Bhagavad Gita and its translation, authentic translation, which still serves as a reference work. In 1823, August Wilhelm Schlegel published the first critical Latin translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gita directly from the Sanskrit text. The title in German was Bhagavad Gita, Textus Recensitus, Latine versus Annotation annotationibus illustratus. It was published from Bonn in 1823. This edition, with its Sanskrit text and Latin translation and scholarly notes, became the standard European version for decades and profoundly influenced subsequent Indological studies. This was August Wilhelm Schlegel, but his elder brother, Friedrich Schlegel, and his response to Gita also played an important role in the spread of Indian philosophy in Germany and other countries of Europe. Friedrich Schlegel didn't produce any commentary on Srimad Bhagavad Gita, but his writings reveal a deep admiration for its philosophical vision, the philosophical vision of Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Schlegel, that is Friedrich Schlegel, the elder brother, regarded Indian philosophy as one of the humanity's oldest and richest intellectual traditions. He believed that Srimad Bhagavad Gita embodied profound metaphysical insight comparable to highest achievements of world philosophy. Especially, he admired the synthetic approach or the holistic approach of Gita, Srimad Bhagavad Gita, and how Srimad Bhagavad Gita viewed philosophy, religion, and ethics with a holistic perspective. This he could appreciate. According to Friedrich Schlegel, Indian thought demonstrated that philosophical inquiry need not be separated from spiritual experience. And Europe needed this emphasis on spirituality in philosophical studies. Therefore, they could appreciate the philosophy of Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Gita's emphasis on immortality of soul. न जायते मृते वा कदाचित्. As the discussion about Atman in Srimad Bhagavad Gita proceeds, this also Friedrich Schlegel could admire. And the second idea that he could appreciate from Gita was the detachment from worldly desires, anasakti yoga, and disciplined action, the philosophy of Karman, that resonated with German romantic idealism. And a school of romantic Orientalism was developing in last decades of 18th century and early decades of 19th century, and these were the scholars, the Schlegel brothers, who were enamored by Indian philosophical text. And soon, Max Muller was to deliver the first ever edition, published edition of Rig Veda with Sayan Bhashya. So this was a unique period of reawakening of Europe about Oriental learning. They had their own limitations and they had their own biases, but they could appreciate the approach, the way the Indian philosophy and the text like Srimad Bhagavad Gita approached the core issues of life. And Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel, considered the teachings of Srimad Bhagavad Gita as evidence of highly developed spiritual culture, and he critiqued the European narrowness for its inability to appreciate the Indian intellectual traditions. He argued that European civilization could enrich itself by studying Sanskrit literature rather than confining itself to Greek and Roman classics. He viewed the rediscovery of Indian wisdom as opening a new chapter in comparative philosophy, comparative religion, and comparative philology as well. On language and wisdom of Indians, in German it is titled Über die Sprache und Weisheit der Indier by Schlegel. This is a landmark work in German. Friedrich Schlegel praised in this work Indian literature and philosophy as foundational to understanding the history of human civilization. He referred to Srimad Bhagavad Gita and he expresses his conviction that Indian sacred texts possess universal philosophical significance. Friedrich Schlegel's greatest contribution to intellectual learning in Europe is his advocacy for Sanskrit studies that inspired the German scholars, especially his younger brother. He regarded Bhagavad Gita as one of the greatest monuments of ancient wisdom. He admired its profound synthesis of metaphysics, ethics, and religion. He views Srimad Bhagavad Gita as a work that united philosophical speculation with practical guidance to life. There were scholars who were approaching Sanskrit text with historical basis, historical linguistics, and Friedrich Schlegel was a bit different from them. He critiqued these scholars and he emphasized on viewing these texts not merely as historical curiosities but as profound philosophical works. He believed that Srimad Bhagavad Gita contained universal truths of enduring philosophical value. So these were his grounds for appreciating Gita, the theory of Nishkam Karma and the unity of soul and the synthetic approach of Gita. He appreciated Gita's vision of unity of all existence, and he regarded its conception of absolute Brahman and the intimate relationship between individual self and the universal reality as evidence of highly profound and developed philosophical tradition. In his view, Indian philosophy demonstrated that metaphysical reflection had flourished outside Europe, in the East, in India, and he challenged the European assumption that philosophy was exclusively a Western achievement. In his magnum opus, which I have referred, Über die Sprache und Weisheit der Indier, that is in English, on the language and wisdom of the Indians, Schlegel placed Indian wisdom as one of the primary sources for human civilization. And his admiration cast a lasting impact on European mind. Especially his advocacy of Sanskrit studies and his admiration of Srimad Bhagavad Gita inspired his younger brother, August Wilhelm Schlegel. And August Wilhelm Schlegel studied Sanskrit under his guidance, became a Sanskrit scholar. He translated Srimad Bhagavad Gita. He published the first critical Latin edition and translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gita with Sanskrit text in 1823. This translation of August Wilhelm Schlegel and his critical introduction became a milestone in European Indology. Together, the Schlegel brothers helped to establish Srimad Bhagavad Gita as a major text in the European intellectual world. And they convinced the intellectuals of Europe of the importance of Srimad Bhagavad Gita for the study of philosophy and comparative religion and philology. August Wilhelm Schlegel occupies a distinguished place in the history of European reception of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, of course, not only by his critical edition, but also by his critical perspective. Unlike his elder brother Friedrich Schlegel, whose appreciation of Gita was primarily philosophical, August Wilhelm Schlegel made a lasting scholarly contribution by producing the first critical edition of Sanskrit text of Srimad Bhagavad Gita. And he regarded Srimad Bhagavad Gita as one of the finest products of Indian civilization and a philosophical poem of exceptional literary and spiritual merit. In the preface to his edition, he praised the work as a text distinguished by nobility of ideas and purity of its moral teaching and the elegance of its poetic expression. He considered it as an outstanding example of intellectual achievements and of ancient India that was worthy of comparison with the greatest classics of European philosophy, especially Greek philosophy. August Wilhelm Schlegel admired Srimad Bhagavad Gita, also like his elder brother, for its synthetic approach to philosophy and religion. He observed that the text reconciles profound metaphysical speculation and practical ethical instruction, presenting a vision of human life in which spiritual knowledge, devotion, that is bhakti, and righteous action, that is karma, are harmoniously integrated. He was particularly impressed by its treatment of dharma and selfless action, that is nishkam karma, and the disciplined pursuit of liberation through knowledge and devotion, jnana yoga and bhakti yoga. As a classical philologist, August Wilhelm Schlegel also appreciated the literary excellence of Gita. The earlier introductions by Gita by Charles Wilkins and his mentor Warren Hastings were marked by their colonial set of mind. But the German scholars, without any privilege and bias, could appreciate the philosophy of Gita, and August Wilhelm Schlegel helped transform the Gita from an unfamiliar Oriental text into a respected classic of world philosophy, worthy of comparison with the masterpieces of Greece and world classics, we can say. August Wilhelm Schlegel occupies a distinguished place in the history of European reception of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, together with his elder brother, whose appreciation of Srimad Bhagavad Gita was primarily philosophical. August Wilhelm Schlegel made a lasting scholarly contribution by producing the first critical edition of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, and he regarded Srimad Bhagavad Gita as one of the finest productions of an intellectual mind. He considered it as an outstanding example of intellectual achievements in ancient India. This opened a gateway for admiration of Srimad Bhagavad Gita throughout Europe. August Wilhelm Schlegel could also admire Srimad Bhagavad Gita for its poetic excellence. Warren Hastings pointed out in his preface that to English readers, many passages of Srimad Bhagavad Gita would appear obscure or even absurd. He could appreciate several passages. He was enamored by the core philosophy, but he was not a Sanskritist, and he was reading Charles Wilkins' translation and writing his preface in his introduction of Gita in his letter to the director of the board of East India Company, the board of directors of the East India Company. So his approach has its own limitations. But these Schlegel brothers, and especially the younger brother Wilhelm, August Wilhelm Schlegel, they were free from the colonial biases and could appreciate Gita in a better way. And this led several other scholars to study Indian philosophy, especially Srimad Bhagavad Gita. And through the efforts of Schlegel brothers, Gita entered the mainstream of European intellectual life and influenced several European philosophers, philologists, amongst them Humboldt. William von Humboldt was one of the foremost intellectuals from Germany. And in my next talk on Srimad Bhagavad Gita in the modern world, I will come to him. Thank you very much.